Hey everybody, my name is Al. I am one of the holders of a very unique, massive Negro League baseball collection, both of photographs and baseball cards. And I get a lot of requests from people to discuss a little bit about specific players or sets. So I've decided just to get out here on YouTube, post a few videos, and do like one for every set and one also for the key cards of specific players. Before I start putting them up there, I was just going to take a step back and let people know a little bit about the Negro Leagues, a little bit of my interest in them. Being a middle-aged white guy, I mean, why in the world do I have one of the best Negro League collections extant? So, the main reason is when I was a little kid and collecting baseball cards of all of the modern day stars in the 1980s, I went to a card show and met a Negro Leaguer by the name of Lou Dials. And Lou told me lots of stories about the Negro Leagues, and I was just shocked. I'd never heard of this history. I mean, Babe Ruth I had heard of. Maybe I had heard a little bit of Satchel Paige. Maybe Josh Gibson here and there, but really not a lot of information. And it really sparked my interest. Number one, just the injustice of the Negro Leagues themselves, and I have a strong sense of justice. And number two, the great players that very few people had ever heard of. And back in the 1980s, we had already had a number of Negro Leaguers inducted to the Hall of Fame. Those first waves that included Page, Gibson, Dandridge, Willie Wells, all these guys who were great players, or Cool Papa Bell, I mean, all these guys who were great players, but were inducted to the Hall of Fame. There wasn't a big collecting stuff. There was really not a lot of cards of them or really anything. So a lot of people came out with Negro League type cards in the 1980s, which were kind of reprints, and people got them to sign some of these Negro League stars in the 1980s and 90s, and that was great. But there was really nothing from their playing years. In fact, a very important thing is, what Negro League cards actually exist. I mean, these were people who would, when they would have the East West All Star games, they would sell out. In Chicago, they would sell out games in Yankee Stadium. So there was a massive following, and yet there were no promotional items at all of Negro League players in the United States, and I just find that absolutely depressing, frankly. I really wish that there was some sets that had Negro Leaguers during their playing years on cards. Now later in the 1950s, you'll get some regional sets that have some Negro Leaguers as they played in the minor leagues. The Oakland Oaks has some of like Artie Wilson and a few other players. But really the key players, the big players, the most important players of the Negro Leagues don't have cards issued in the United States. So that's kind of a sad fact, but the good news is for us, a lot of these Latin players played. I mean, a lot of these Negro League players played in the Latin American leagues, which really for us, for most purposes of collecting, we're going to really focus in on four countries. The most important one of the early part of baseball's history was Cuba. A lot of guys went down to play in Cuba. And Cuba had a great baseball, still does have a great baseball, strength and belief, and it's really their number one, sport. So, it in the early 1900s, from say 1905 to 1935, and actually all the way up to probably actually 1950, there's just some great Cuban players, great Cuban teams, and a bunch of African Americans or Negro League players wound up playing there. Some of the most notable, of course, are Pop Lloyd, Oscar Charleston. For those of you who are familiar with Bill James, I think it's probably a name if you've read his baseball encyclopedias. Those names will jump out to you. Why? Because Oscar Charleston was named the number 4 player ever to play baseball by Bill James, and I think Pop Lloyd's 20, 26, something like that. So these are players that are of the most elite status in all of baseball history, black, white, integrated. So those guys have some amazing cards that come out of Cuba, and the Cuban cards, especially the ones that we'll talk about with one exception, up until 1930 are all photographic. So for me, I love the photographic cards. They're just beautiful. They're not printed. They're real photographs. Most of them are hand cut. They weren't intended to survive this long. And when you couple in everything that's happened in Cuba, which we won't get into the politics here, it's amazing that any of this stuff survived. And the reality is there's just a handful of copies of each one of those cards around. So I'll show you those cards, and we'll talk a little bit about them when we talk about individual players as well as complete sets. All in all, Cuba probably has the most important Latin American cards. But, there were also cards issued in Venezuela, especially some key Martin de Higo cards when he played down there. And there are some other very, very few cards issued from Mexico. Those are really tough to get. And it seems odd that there are so few. And all of the superstars played there. De Higo himself, again, Gibson played there. Dandridge, and some of the second-tier Negro League stars like Bill Wright and others that just have some. They would be amazing if there were cards, and there are a few. So on the course of all my videos, I'll show those to you. And then, Puerto Rico in the 1940s just had a boom. They really, had a bunch of great Negro League stars to go down there to play, as well as major league prospects and major league players as well. So the Cuban are probably the number one in terms of the quality and depth of the cards that they have. But the Puerto Ricans are a close second because they have 4 what I'm just going to call amazing sets, and those sets are the Toleteros sets, which Toleteros is loosely translated to sluggers, and so they have these sluggers sets from the 1940s, and they were over the winter, so people can work on their game, and so you have 3 major sets: 48-49, 49-50, and 50-51, and there's an inaction set to the 50-51. The 50-51 also has the legendary Josh Gibson card, which we'll look at. And a lot of people, there's a lot of controversy on this card, whether this is rookie card or whether or not. I'll share my opinion more in depth when we talk about that particular card. But in general, it's an image of Josh Gibson from the 1940s when he was playing in Puerto Rico, and issued pretty close to his playing years as a homenaje, a homage to him and all that he had given the league as such a great slugger. So it's a pretty special card. There aren't that many of them out there, and that's probably what made these sets famous. But there's a lot of other cards that many people consider rookies, including the rookie of Hilton Smith and Willard Brown, well into their playing years, but their first card. So if you're a rookie Hall of Fame collector, those are pretty important cards as well. So we'll look at the Toleteros. So Cubans, we're going to look at the 1909 Cabañas, 1910 Punch. We're going to skip, unfortunately, many years until 1923, where we start to get into the Nacionales, the Thomas Gutierrez, and the Billiken sets, or Billiken, which a lot of people call them. I spent a lot of years in Latin America, so I'll have a little bit of a Spanish accent to some of these pronunciations. And then we'll go on to the Segundas, the Aguilitas Segundos, and the other Aguilitas set in the late 20s. And then there's a big gap in Cuba from this point after the Mallorquinas, actually in 27, 28, until we get to the Caramelos Deportivos from the 1940s, and Montiel, and a bunch of other great sets like Campo Alegre, El Indio. So we'll cover all of those sets. They'll each have their own video, and I'll try to show you some of the most important cards. And I'll walk through all of the Toletero sets from Puerto Rico, and I'll walk through the Denia set, which is actually one of my personal favorites, also from Puerto Rico, that came out probably, I think, one of the only sets ever to be issued with milk. If you think about that, that's kind of crazy. In the course of these videos, I'm actually going to whip out some cards that have never been seen on the market, that have been kind of held by me very close. I haven't shared them, haven't shared scans, but I think they're massively important cards, and I'll spend some time on that too. So I will also add some videos that are going to follow the track of my book. I'll probably do this at the end. I'm currently writing a book of the top 100 Negro League cards, so I will also do that. And when I'm done kind of with the Negro League stuff, I will try to focus a little bit on some soccer cards, which is a new interest of me, or not new, the last 4 or 5 years. I've been accumulating a bunch of knowledge, and this is a very global, interesting thing. So I'll also do the same for soccer cards, soccer stars, and hope you enjoy this. Please leave comments. Let me know what you think. If indeed you want to see certain things. If first time I do this, so if you can't see clearly, I'm not being answering your questions. Feel free to leave some messages, and I'll either type them out or write other videos to address them for the broader audience. Thanks so much, and hope you enjoy what is sure to be a good time if you have any interest in Negro League cards or history, and look forward to doing this. Thanks so much.